Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining me today because, well, we're tackling something absolutely crucial. We're looking at an incredibly complex and honestly profoundly important intersection in American life, the nexus of race, geography, and environmental health. We hear a lot about pollution in the abstract, but today we're going to make it concrete. We're looking at the hard data and the history of how policy, industry, and your literal zip code all collide. So here's a pretty provocative question for you. Can your zip code predict your air quality? Or, say, your risk of respiratory illness? What about your proximity to hazardous waste? Today, we aren't just relying on opinions to answer that. No way. We're relying purely on the data. We're going to look at decades of documented research, government reports, and even modern case studies to figure out exactly why some communities breathe clean air, while others, well, they end up serving as the exhaust pipe for industrial progress. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We'll start with the birth of a movement, move into the anatomy of a sacrifice zone, look at industry and Cancer Alley, explore the tech boom's toxic toll, and finally, wrap up with the fight for justice. All right, part one, the birth of a movement, from local protests to a national framework. So, environmental racism, it's not just a buzzword. It's actually a specific, heavily researched framework pioneered by academics like Dr. Robert Bullard. At its core, it describes the disproportionate placement of polluting facilities, hazardous waste, and toxic infrastructure right in communities of color. And the data shows us this absolutely isn't accidental. It's driven by systemic zoning practices, historical redlining, and really unequal regulatory protections. Essentially, these practices have steered the most dangerous industries right to the paths of least political resistance. Let's look at how this movement actually crystallized nationally. Back in 1982, down in Warren County, North Carolina, a predominantly rural Black community literally laid their bodies down on the roads. Why? To stop trucks from dumping highly toxic PCB-contaminated soil into their neighborhood. Now, while the landfill was ultimately built, those protests sparked a nationwide civil rights awakening. That direct action led straight to a crucial 1983 Government Accountability Office report, and then to the landmark 1987 United Church of Christ Toxic Waste and Race report. And guys, that 1987 report was earth-shattering. It statistically proved that race was the single most significant variable associated with the location of commercial hazardous waste facilities in the entire United States. Moving on to part two, anatomy of a sacrifice zone, the mechanics of systemic inequity. For a really long time, there was this assumption. Academics called it the post-siting demographic change hypothesis. Basically, the idea was that polluting facilities were built, housing prices naturally dropped, and marginalized groups simply moved there for cheaper rent. Makes sense on the surface, right? But research by Paul Mohai and Robin Saha at the University of Michigan starkly challenged this. By meticulously tracking historical census and zoning data, they found the exact opposite. Hazardous facilities were overwhelmingly placed in neighborhoods that already contained higher concentrations of minority and low-income residents. In other words, the pollution was brought to the people, not the other way around. Take a look at the data from the EPA and a major study in Science Advances. They looked at PM 2.5. That's the superfine particulate matter that gets deep into your lungs and bloodstream. The numbers reveal a stark disparity. Black and Hispanic or Latinx populations face significantly higher exposure to this dangerous pollution from pretty much all major emission sources compared to white populations. And honestly, the most striking part of this whole study, the researchers found this disparity holds true regardless of income. Let that sink in for a second. Race, much more than wealth, dictates your proximity to dangerous air. Which brings us to Section 3, Industry and Cancer Alley, the physical reality of legacy pollution. 200. I really want you to just let that staggering number sink in. 200. According to investigations by Human Rights Watch, that is the sheer volume of fossil fuel and petrochemical operations packed into just an 85-mile stretch of Louisiana along the Mississippi River. This corridor is predominantly home to historically Black communities, and today it's widely known as Cancer Alley because of the intense concentration of toxic air pollution and the severe public health impacts that come with it. And if we move from Louisiana up to Chicago, we find another stark spatial reality. They call it the toxic donut. This is the term used to describe the area around Altgeld Gardens, which is a predominantly Black public housing community on Chicago's South Side. Just imagine for a second your own home, but heavily encircled by landfills, industrial scrapyards, sewage treatment facilities, and hazardous waste sites. That is what a fence-line community actually looks like in practice. But out of that toxic donut came some absolutely incredible leadership. Hazel Johnson, who was a resident of Altgeld Gardens, started noticing these staggering rates of cancer, respiratory illness, and skin conditions in her community. And she didn't just wait for outside help. She pioneered community-led research, meticulously documenting the illnesses and mapping out the surrounding polluters. Today, she's widely recognized as the mother of environmental justice. Her grassroots organizing really brought a human face to the devastating statistics of these urban sacrifice zones. And if we shift out west to Los Angeles, the pattern just repeats itself. Based on CDC and USC data, whether we're looking at communities exposed to neighborhood oil drilling in South LA or the devastating lead contamination from the former Exide battery plant in Southeast LA, the exposure is incredibly concentrated. The overwhelming majority of those living right in the shadow of these hazards are working-class Black and Latinx residents. So the really crucial takeaway here is that from the Deep South up to the Midwest and over to the West Coast, the geographical blueprint of environmental racism is just remarkably consistent. Let's move to Section 4, the tech boom's toxic toll, artificial intelligence, and the new frontier of pollution. Now, you might be thinking this is mostly about old factories, but take the totally contemporary case of Elon Musk's xAI expansion in Memphis, Tennessee. To run Colossus, which is this incredibly energy-intensive AI data center, the company brought in massive gas combustion turbines for power. According to reports from the Southern Environmental Law Center and local advocates, these turbines were operating without the standard air quality permits. They were emitting massive amounts of smog-forming nitrogen oxides and particulate matter directly into South Memphis, which, you guessed it, is a predominantly Black neighborhood that already suffers from heavy industrial pollution. When we compare the two side by side, the logic behind where these things are built remains identical. Legacy petrochemicals gave us dioxins and benzene, leading to cancer and neurological damage. Modern AI data centers, with their literally insatiable thirst for power, are bringing gas turbines and diesel backup generators into these exact same neighborhoods. They're emitting PM2.5 and nitrogen oxides that cause asthma and heart disease. The product might be cutting-edge artificial intelligence instead of plastic, but the hidden respiratory costs are being paid by the exact same demographics. And this is exactly why the NAACP has stepped in with a federal lawsuit regarding that Memphis data center. Legal advocates are viewing this modern technological pollution through the exact same civil rights lens that was established way back in the 1980s. They're arguing that bypassing health protections to fast-track AI in a historically Black neighborhood isn't an isolated incident. It's a direct continuation of environmental racism. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the fight for justice, grassroots resistance, and legal pushback. Across the country, these fence-line communities are not just sitting by, they're disrupting the system using a really clear multi-step playbook. Step 1, community air monitoring. In places like Philadelphia with the Thrive Air Project, or right there in South Memphis, residents aren't waiting around for the EPA. They're setting up their own air monitors to scientifically track those unsafe PM2.5 levels. Step 2, grassroots organizing. From the Duwamish River Valley up in Seattle to the West Oakland Indicators Project, residents are forming powerful coalitions to force local governments to act. And Step 3, civil rights litigation. Communities are using Title V of the Civil Rights Act to file federal complaints against discriminatory zoning and permitting. They are literally turning data into legal accountability. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, right? All the way from the PCB protests of Warren County in 1982 to the AI data centers of today. And I think it leaves us with a really critical, undeniable question to ponder. If the cutting-edge technology driving our future relies on the exact same environmental sacrifices of the past, who truly pays the price for our progress? I really hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity to maybe look a little closer at your own city's zoning map and to keep learning about the ongoing fight for environmental justice. Thanks so much for learning with me today.